Hi, I'm Tom O'Connell, a volunteer at Eastside Freedom Library and a retired professor of political studies at Metropolitan State University here in the Twin Cities. Welcome to the very first in a series of conversations about the interconnected crises facing our communities and our world. A global pandemic, the worst economic downturn since the Great Depression, police violence and racial inequality, voter repression, and a dangerously divided body politic. And I haven't even mentioned climate change and other threats to our shared life here on the planet Earth. Fortunately, history is full of examples of people and movements rising to the challenge. And people and movements are making history today. We'll be hearing from some of them through the rest of 2020. What can we learn from history? What are we learning from our own experiences today? We're calling this series Learning from the Past, Fighting for the Future. And here to get us started is artist activist Ricardo Levins-Morales. And here's a quote about Carlos. He's an artist by trade, a healer by temperament, and a troublemaker by necessity. Ricardo combines art, writing, and close relationship with emerging social justice activists to support the struggle for a more livable world. Thank you for joining us. Really appreciate it. Carlos, can you talk a little bit about your experiences growing up in Western Puerto Rico? I know that's an important part of who you are.
Sure. Yeah, I grew up in the mountains above the township of Rico, which is in the coffee growing region in the Western Cordillera of Puerto Rico. And we were on a farm. My parents were both born in New York. My mother, New York Puerto Rican, and my father of Eastern European Jewish background. But they moved to Puerto Rico about 6 years before I was born. And that's where I grew up. They ended up farming until later my father was able to get a teaching job in the city.
Wow.
Commute 4 hours each way, spend several days in San Juan and then come back.
Okay.
Mountains.
Yeah.
And they were involved in the independence movement. I got some sort of political air to breathe from that, although they never lectured us kids about politics or anything. And I think maybe probably the most relevant thing to my current day politics is that I grew up playing in the woods and on the mountainside. And there's a lot about what you can learn from an ecosystem that has formed sort of the basis of the way I think about organizing. You know, tipping points and feedback loops and depletion and regeneration. Nothing in my world had a fast forward or a pause button. So everything takes its time. And when I moved to the US, at a time of crisis, in fact, in the 60s, I think the way I observed the activism happening around me was through that lens.
So you write about and talk about this idea of the ebb and flow of history and the ebb and flow of movements. And somehow you've been able to kind of sustain a sense of hope and durability and that appreciation that you learned on the farm back in Puerto Rico.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that simply was absorbed, you know, kind of on a cellular level is that things develop in cycles, you know, like stay in ebbs and flows. And so when I came to the US in the middle of a period of mass movements, that was kind of the reality I was in those churning waters. And when those mass movements dissipated, for me, it wasn't an existential crisis. Oh my God, the world has changed. Now the tide is out. So what are the tasks that we need to fulfill when the tide is out so that we'll be ready for the next time it comes in? So that's really helped me a lot in dealing with the ups and downs, progress and defeats and backslides. When a tide is coming in, that doesn't mean it's steady progress because the waves come in and the waves go out, even while the tide is rising. So that has helped me to keep some perspective. The fortunes and misfortunes of the struggle.
You've written about your work as a medicine or antibodies, and you're fighting or to treat, I guess, a social disease that you refer to as hopelessness. So how does that work? How is your work antibodies?
Well, I start from the premise that the soul knows how to heal itself, the body knows how to heal itself, community knows how to heal itself. I mean, resilience is really the central message of life, of natural ecological life, so that often a body will be overwhelmed with toxins. Our nervous systems, our spirits can be overwhelmed with lies, and communities can be overwhelmed with disempowering messages, so that really what we need to do is try to counteract those messages. It's not that we need to teach people how to be resilient or teach soil how to regenerate. We just have to stop the poisoning.
Yeah.
The body knows how to heal.
Yeah.
But when it's under assault, it forgets that. And we self-medicate thinking that's nutritious, right? When
Yeah.
it's just how we cope with an overwhelm of oppression and abuse that we don't know how to process. It's too much for us.
Yeah.
So work, whether we're farmers, healers, or organizers, to help support the natural healing and regeneration systems that all living systems and complex systems contain.
Yeah. So in this time we're in now, and we're in cyclically and in some ways constantly, we're given the history of the U.S., the issue of race is central. And speaking for myself as a white person, how to relate to that struggle with brothers and sisters of color is a huge one. And you were asked by a group of white allies to really address that question. How do we, as whites, allied to the struggle? And this is about 4 or 5 years ago, when we had another rising up, Black Lives Matter, against police violence. And I was struck by some of your advice and your references to some historical figures who were white, and weren't afraid to make mistakes. They did the work. And can you talk a little bit about your approach to whites being involved in
I think, we actually don't know if they were afraid to make mistakes.
Yeah, that's true.
But the important thing is that they kept doing the work.
Yeah.
You refer to this time as a time in which race is central. I assume you're referring to the last 500 years.
Yeah.
That's always been the case. But yeah, one of the things for white folks to keep in mind is don't expect clear instructions from anyone.
Yeah.
Or if you get any, they'll be contradictory from the clear instructions you're getting from someone else. This is something that we need to navigate. And navigating means being as grounded as possible in who you are and your understandings. Do some studying, but studying also comes through struggle. There's a lot of temptation for white people to retreat into endless discussion groups and book clubs, try to purge themselves of racism before getting from on the picket line or whatever. And I think that's a mistake, that we learn through practice, and that no one has time to give you sort of cookie cutter gold stars for doing it.
Yeah.
Because for all the ways in which it's frightening, all the fears that come up, all the consequences that you can face for it, it's nothing compared to what it is to be targeted by racism and the other forms of oppression that people who are called marginalized but really targeted have to face just surviving, right? But another thing I want to say is that I think that organizers and activists of color often spend too much time trying to figure out how to educate white folks. That one of the problems with whiteness is that it always centers white people.
Yeah.
And actually doing the work of building cross-racial alliances between Latinx people and Asian people and Black people and, indigenous people and so forth is, I think, actually the central work. And that part of the education of white folks is to see organizing happen that's not all about them. Just sort of sit and listen and watch and not have it always being translated for you. And then figure out what to do with it. So being on the sidelines, watching and figuring out what to do is an important practice,
Yeah.
to get used to, right?
So I've been struck, and many commentators have been struck by how, at least here in the Twin Cities, and I guess around the country, there's been, of course, huge marches and a lot of white people participating along with Black folks and folks of color. Do you have a perspective on that? Does this strike you as surprising or a good thing, or how do you explain
Well,
it?
no, it's not surprising. And in fact, um, solidarity across lines is much more present in history than we're led to believe.
Mm-hmm.
Easily forgotten.
Yeah.
We always remember stories of betrayal and we forget stories of solidarity. But every upsurge, every movement and struggle that I've been part of has included people stepping forth across those boundaries, perfectly, in fact, almost never perfectly, willing to take risks on behalf of each other and going through conversions of consciousness in the process.
Okay.
And out of each of those upsurge, we get to keep some of those people. Depending on how we use these moments of crisis, some of them we lose again. The consciousness wasn't sufficiently transformed in the process, and they go back to either passivity or just trying to go back to their normal lives, having been bruised in the process and sufficiently transformed. But I think it's really important, and it's always complex. It's like there's always a tension, the tension of where the heck have you been all these years, right, when we were going through hell. Also, the need to simply welcome people into the struggle. And I think it's significant right now that, you have a lot of people stepping forth, including white folks. You have white-dominated institutions, corporations, all tripping over each other to show how right on they are. Much of that, of course, is opportunist. It's significant that the language they're talking and the conversation they're trying to step up to is about racial justice, not just about policing. There's a time where it's not possible to segregate and silo these things from each other anymore. That, we just have to, address the police. No, actually, we have to address everything. The economy and education and housing and all the rest, because that's where justice comes from. And it's the enforcement of these inequalities is the whole purpose of the police anyway.
Yeah. One of the things that I've been struck with about your work is your intentionality and your success, at least it appears to me from the outside, I guess, with developing relationships with, new generation of folks. So you and I share a rough chronology in terms of our age. Both of us were involved with very different perspectives in the movement back in the 60s and 70s, different parts of that, but we came of age. Our consciousness was shaped. I've got a lot of friends now, and we used to have a slogan that was very unfortunate. It was, I don't know if it ever went beyond the sort of white anti-war movement. Never trust anybody over 30. I don't know if you remember that. So what happens when you turn 30? So how have you gone about, and how have you experienced relationships with people coming up, might be half your age?
Well, I don't know. My daughter's analysis is that I never grew up.
Good.
I don't know how accurate that is, but I think I don't really know how to answer that. I've been very grateful that young people, as soon as they're old enough to have their own social media accounts, will often, a lot of them will use my art as their profile pictures.
Yeah.
Who have not aged out with my generation is significant. But I think I've never retreated from activism. And every wave of activism is youth-led, so that in order to be in relationship with that, to keep my artwork useful, requires being in relationship. Another thing is, and this is, I find, talking with young people, that there's a real hunger for movement mentors. But when they go out to try to find them, all they find are too many movement veterans. by which I mean people who want to talk about their glory days,
Yeah, yeah,
time in their life when they felt most alive,
yeah.
that they're nostalgic for,
Hmm.
really useful, right? What's useful are people who can listen and understand that, in fact, the good old days were really no more good than any other days.
Yep.
That in 1972, we were just as brilliant and just as clueless as people today.
Yep.
There are lessons that we knew then that have been forgotten. There are things that we didn't know that have been our insights that more recent generations have developed in the struggle and learn from it. It's really the dialogue that's necessary. I encourage young people when they're thinking about the elders and the ancestors in the struggle, not to just evoke their names, but to try to be in conversation with them.
Mm.
What is it that kept Ella Baker up at night?
Yep.
You know, what is it that confounded Malcolm X? You know, how is it that Tecumseh navigated the temptations of some of the tribal leaders of his day to make deals with the devil and with the US government and break the coalitional work, right? I mean, the things that we try to figure out are very similar in every generation, even though the conditions look very different.
Yes.
Tools that we have at our disposal are different.
You know, when I was coming up, a lot of the folks who would have been movement mentors had been suppressed, almost buried from history through the anti-communist movements, the Joe McCarthy era. And I really didn't know anybody who was a radical until later, until I really made it my business and discovered a whole bunch of people who had been organizers, some communists, some socialists. Here in Minnesota, of course, farm to labor rights. And it was life-changing. And I think it was also valuable for them to have some folks who are actually interested in their story, where they could come out and tell it again. How did you connect with the previous generation of radicals when you were a kid coming up?
Well, I mean, I certainly had the example of my parents, whose own revolutionary politics was really deeply personal. That they never lectured us kids about politics, lived by example, so that we really absorbed values more than anything else. And, you know, again, I was off from that, you know, when I moved out of home at 15, right? Out of high school, that was sort of the other part of my origin story is after we moved to Chicago, the turbulence of mass uprisings, adolescence, immigration, moving out, dropping out all at once, right?
Yeah.
Storm. But I forgot what the starting point
Well, I
was.
was just asking about how you connect
elders,
with the previous
elders and
generations.
mentors.
Elders,
Yeah, so I was learning a lot from the people around. Now, remember at that time, the 50s had intervened, right? There was mass organizing in this country in the 1930s. And then a lot of that was suppressed during McCarthyism in the 50s, so that it was kind of a missing link. There were not that many people I would consider elders who were accessible.
Yeah.
You could read about them.
Mm-hmm.
More, I was really tuned into the internet of the day, which was leaflets and newspapers. Every little group had a newspaper. There were international ones coming in. So I could see other struggles that were happening simultaneously.
Yeah.
Than really looking into the past and learning at that time from those previous struggles. Yeah. Now, as a kid of 13, 14, 15, a lot of the people who looked like elders to me were in their 20s.
Yeah.
So that one of the sort of deepest impressions on my own organizer DNA was the work that Fred Hampton, Chacha Jimenez, and others in the Black Panthers, the Young Lords, and others around Chicago were doing at that time. And those people were like 21, 22, 23. To me, those were elders, right? When Fred Hampton was killed, and that's really what pivoted me into organizing, was when the police murdered Fred Hampton and Mark Clark, two young black leaders in the community, he was only 21 years old. Right? That's kind of...
That's amazing. Yeah.
Yeah, that's sort of the milieu that us young activists had to work with, right? The old people were 25.
Yeah. Now, were you involved, you mentioned the Puerto Rican struggle, was that sort of your initial movement work, or what were you thinking and doing back in those days?
Well, as a kid in Puerto Rico, I was aware of the struggle. By the time I was growing up, the movement activism had moved away from the mountains into the cities, right? So there wasn't much going on in the community, in our little isolated barrio. Although people, organizers from the city would come up and meet on our farm, and I'd get to listen in on those conversations. Moving to the States, I was in a place where the people around me were all black and white. You know, very small numbers of people of other identities. I had to get on the Halstead Avenue bus and ride for probably an hour or more to get out to the Puerto Rican community where the Young Lords were organizing, and I would do that, right? Meet in their headquarters or help plant trees in the People's Park they'd taken over, that kind of thing. But it wasn't the center of my organizing life. Really, the Panther Defense Committee was kind of my home base. I would sell the Panther paper at my high school during the period I was still in high school in one arm, and the Young Lords newspaper on the other arm, right? And then the organizing I was involved in had to do with working with this patchwork of other groups and identities. Yeah. And identity was a different thing in those days, so that...
How so?
Well, it was really understood that we were out to take down an empire. When you're out to take down an empire, you know in your bones that nobody gets to do that alone. Yeah. We need each other. So that organizers like Fred Hampton, who was very powerfully rooted in his Black identity and organizing within the Black community, saw identity as a stepping stone towards solidarity. Identity allows you to fight, solidarity allows you to win. Solidarity wasn't an option on the a la carte menu. It was fundamental. It was sacred. That's what we need. To come to the table in solidarity, we all need to know ourselves, people, our own history, and we need to learn everything we can about each other as well. Yeah. Just like a teenager figuring out their identity, you can only go so far knowing about yourself unless you start learning about other people. You won't know ever what's unique to yourself. So that's one of the ways, 40 years after the suppression of those movements, especially the movements of color and the leadership of color, there was kind of the fist and the glove. The movements were suppressed and massive amounts of money poured into the nonprofit system. Yeah. Took over the mutual aid part of the movement and turned it into services. Yeah. So that really took away the cutting edge power of those movements from two fronts. And 40 years now, or 45 years of the nonprofit system has really transformed identity into a brand. Every identity is its own brand that you need to keep pure so that you can appeal to funders. Other identities are competitive, and you protect your intellectual property. Very different environment, right? So that, for example, when the Los Seis de la Raza, I think it was called, some Chicano activists in LA got framed up on charges by the cops. They organized around the slogan Brown Power, taken directly from Black Power, and organized a defense committee. The Panthers went and gave them training, and in fact, turned over the center 8-page pullout of their newspaper, every issue for 6 months, and said, you can use that as your newspaper. In the meantime, we'll train you how to put out your own. That September, they spun them off and they could do their own thing. So that kind of interrelationship was something that was taken for granted. And I mentioned earlier how solidarity is forgotten. People don't realize that by the second day of the Stonewall rebellion, people from the Black Panthers, the anti-war movement, and other struggles were there on the ground participating, right? Yeah. So we forget we forget the ways in which we've helped each other. We only remember those moments when it felt like we were going it alone.
Yeah.
That disarms us in moments
Yes.
like this, when we need to be able to, protect who we are, where the struggle is. We have to recognize, for example, that this is a Black-led struggle, Black youth-led primarily, and at the same time, it's everybody's struggle. So how do we navigate that? Recognizing and honoring the leadership, but understanding that we all need to absorb into our bones that this struggle is for the liberation of everybody, right? Mm-hmm. This is Grace Lee Boggs, the legendary organizer out of Detroit. The way she phrased it, I always loved that, is by saying that I'm a part of and apart from our struggle. And that's the kind of familial relationship I think we need to have with each other.
Yeah. So Ricardo, one of the things that I know about you is your interest in having conversations with historical figures who are very much alive, even though they might be dead, literally in bodily sense. And Frederick Douglass being one of so many. And one of the things that you wrote about in relationship to Frederick Douglass was this whole issue of compromise and the relationship between a beautiful and transformative and necessary vision of fundamental change, and perhaps some necessity on the way to make compromise. That is one of the most difficult questions, I think, movement in organizing, and one that oftentimes sets people against one another. How do you, well, let me ask it this way. You've been involved with MPD 150, which seems like an example of a movement goal, which on the one hand could be viewed as a grand vision impossible to achieve. On the other hand, a testament to what really good organizing can achieve. Can you talk a little bit about that experience?
Well, sure. And I think Frederick Douglass is a good example of the kind of organizing, because when he started finding his voice in the abolition movement, there were not many people advocating for complete emancipation and full equal rights. And instead of saying, well, okay, I guess that's not achievable, he really asked the question, how can we make it achievable? And he figured out that he needed his own media. He started several different newspapers in his, and just hammering that drumbeat of real freedom, real vision, the real liberation, until he had a powerful current in the movement going with him. So I think it is really a difference between organizing on the basis of what are people ready for and what do people hunger for, right? And that's really the artist approach, is how do you go past what people believe to what people want, what people dream about when they go to sleep and they let their guard down, right? And there are different challenges to both kinds of organizing, but one will get you to where you ultimately want to be. That with MPD 150, which is only one of the groups that has been beating this drumbeat, but in this city, we started out about 5 years ago, noticing that the 150th anniversary of the police department in Minneapolis was coming up. They were founded in 1867, and we wondered what would it be like to create a performance review for how they've been doing for 150 years. Do they deserve to be re-upped or not, right? And the idea was to really make clear that the toxicity, the brutality, the corruption of the Minneapolis police has been at the core of their existence from the very beginning. And that in fact police reforms are simply part of the endless cycle of maintaining the status quo. They're rather useless reforms that are put into place to make people feel better and then are eroded within 2 or 3 years anyway and undermined. And the police are very confident with those kinds of reforms. They fight them, but they know that it doesn't really threaten them. Legitimacy has never really been threatened, or at least not since the era of the Panthers. So we just, we were looking at the way in which, telling the truth when the police commit an atrocity at first feels liberating. After the 100th time, it can start becoming depleting, right, and re-traumatizing, especially if all you have on the menu are these tepid reforms that never set anybody's heart on fire. So what we're trying to do is figure out, well, how can we put something else on the agenda? How can we add to the menu something hopeful and more transformative? And is it possible to take an idea that sounds naive and utopian, like police abolition, and expose it as being actually the only pragmatic course for a future that meets people's needs, and that in fact the continuation of the police system is really magical thinking.
Yeah.
It's really what's naive, that you can turn it into something that it isn't. So it's kind of been our drumbeat, you know, and we were scattering those seeds, and other groups like Reclaim the Block, Black Visions Collective, have been stepping up and translating that into the arenas of policy work and organizing. MPD 150 was strictly about changing the narrative. And now that those rains have come, we see those seeds sprouting, and people are organizing around a vision that wouldn't even have been part of the conversation 5 years ago.
Yeah.
You know, so that's really how you flip that narrative. And Frederick Douglass, who seems to have something to say about everything, one of his quotes addresses that as well. You know, I might even have the quote itself handy. Here it is. So he's talking in 1862. That was 5 years before the Minneapolis Police Department was formed. He says it is one of the strangest and most humiliating triumphs of human selfishness and prejudice over human reason, that it leads men to look upon emancipation as an experiment, instead of being as it is the natural order of human relations. Slavery and not freedom is the experiment. And to witness its horrible failure, we have to open our eyes not merely on the blasted soil of Virginia and other slave states, but on a whole land brought to the edge of ruin. Right? So what you know he's talking about could be, with the change of a few words, could be looking at police, because people right now in this moment, after the city council has taken a step forward and crossed that line toward police abolition, people are saying, well, wait a minute, isn't that just a reckless and dangerous experiment? How can you really be serious about taking away the one thing we know? No, actually, policing has been a horrible failure as an experiment in human safety and management of society. Policing is a fairly recent innovation, and it's been, you know, a sort of a cruel, a cruel reality for the last 15 decades, certainly in this town. And mutual aid, resourcing communities, that's actually the natural state of things. But to look at a future without policing, as Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez recently pointed out, you merely have to look at the white suburbs, where the police are not, you know, breaking down doors, harassing kids on the street. And why is that? The people there have nice homes, have good schools that are resourced, have enough food to eat and green parks to play in, right? So that the answer to, you know, police who are there to enforce inequality is, well, let's deal with inequality. Let's resource the people's communities. And you won't need a 19th century paramilitary racist militia to keep people in line.
Yeah. You know, one of the things that this movement has reminded me of, and I need reminding, I think many of us, is here is it is a radical notion that is being discussed not only in the city council of Minneapolis and the people of Minneapolis, but all over the country. And that there's so many gatekeepers, and sometimes I play that role. Political parties, you mentioned nonprofits, community organizations, which are quote unquote progressive, where no, you don't want to say that. That's a demand too far. You know, you can't open up that can of worms. I mean, you're going to freak people out. And when actually what is needed is opening something up so we can look at it in a different way. And that's really what this is, I think, about.
If somebody has to be out on the mountainside with a machete
Yeah.
to open a path, if other people are ever going to walk down it.
Yeah, well put. Okay, I want to finish with just a couple questions. One is perennial. What, and it's come up in social movements and democratic organizing, small d, over and over again. What do you see as the relationship toward electoral work, electoral politics, and the street or community politics? Is there a relationship, a dynamic, a tension? How do you think about that?
Well, I don't really make distinctions in between some of these realms. For example, inside the system, outside the system. I think the most important question is, are we living inside the delusion or outside the delusion? And there are places where we might wander in that landscape that are more strategically important than others.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes that might be within electoral politics and other times not.
Mm-hmm.
I describe those spaces inside the system, negotiating halls and congresses and, legislatures as moon spaces. If the moon reflects the light of the sun, it doesn't generate power, it simply reflects power.
Mm.
The degree to which those spaces are useful depends on the power that's exerted on the outside. It helps to have people on the inside who are allies, but going into that system without strong support from the outside, it's inevitable that you get absorbed and have to make the kinds of deals that that system thrives on. And the way to make progress within the system is to agree to betray somebody. Like, we'll give you this concession as long as you support this bill that leaves somebody else behind. And the only way you can be in a powerful position where you can't do that is that the movements on the outside are powerful enough to articulate their own agenda. Otherwise, you're simply signing off and trying to lessen the harm done by the initiatives coming from corporations, developers, and all the rest. Yeah. And people can change. Certainly there are people on the inside who have been transformed by struggle because the offer has been put on the menu.
Yeah.
They thought that the best offer was the one they were taking on the inside.
Mm-hmm.
That relationship, it's always shifting, but it essentially comes down to, it's different at different levels of politics though. So at the national level, if we're talking about presidents, that's simply a question of who we want to help select to lead the armies against us. We do not put people into the White House to the process of change. We put them in there because we would prefer the weakest opponent possible and those less able to effectively oppose us.
As I look at so much of your work and your art, your counsel to organizers and activists, it reminds me that at the best, social movements can really be an experience of solidarity. You've used that word many times, of our humanity. They can be uplifting. At times, we can be at our less than uplifting. Is one of your goals to try to remind people of our own humanity and to always work towards solidarity, understanding there will be disagreements? And that
I think everything I do, whether it's art, speaking, or anything else, is trying to find ways to remind people of what they already know. Yeah. Whether they remember that they know it or not. I think that's absolutely true. Okay. People are very smart. People know the answers. All animals do. Yeah. But we get fooled, we get bribed, we get scared into believing in a world based on scarcity, which is the capitalist model of existence. And when we're faced with scarcity, we scramble for resources. But really, it's in alliance that we can change the nature so that, in fact, how we organize tells a story. And the demands that we put forward can include everybody. And that's how you remind people and teach people that solidarity is possible, by living it in the way that you make your demands. Okay. That it's not about me. If I'm demanding for me, then you'll get scared that you're going to be left out. If I'm demanding for us, then that's an invitation. Whether you're yet in a position to take that invitation or not depends on many historical factors, but that door must always be left open.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Ricardo Levins-Morales, for taking the time to have this conversation. I really appreciate it. And I know that our viewers will as well. So for folks who want to learn more about Ricardo's work and about his art, right, we can go to your website at
RLM.
Excuse me, yeah, okay, thank you.
My initials.
Yeah, your initials. So rlmartstudio.com. And you planning on opening soon or whenever, or what? How's that going?
We're open online to take orders.
Okay, that's great.
We did curbside pickup at this time, but other than that, we want to keep ourselves and other people safe, and we'll post as we respond to changing conditions.
All right. Well,
but when you say learning about my art, I just want to let people know that learning about my work hopefully is learning about yours.
Yes.
What I try to do through my work is reflect the struggles that you all who are on the front lines of organizing and activism are carrying out, and to try to support that in whatever way I as an artist can do.
Okay. And you have been doing that so much. Again, thank you very much. Now for folks, this will be played on the Eastside Freedom Library Facebook page and on our YouTube channel. And it'll be there on a recurring basis, so you can check it out. And for more information,
for those who want to learn more about the narrative organizing of MPD 150,
yes,
MPD150.com.
Okay, can you say that again?
MPD150.com.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thanks a lot, Ricardo.
Thank you very much. Be well.
Yes.
Stay safe. Be powerful.
Yes.
Thank you for visiting our video. I'm Beth Cleary.
I'm Peter Ratcliffe, and this is Orso, the library dog.
We are the co-founders and co-executive directors of the East Side Freedom Library in St. Paul, Minnesota.
Our mission is to inspire solidarity, work for justice, and advocate for equity for all. If you enjoy our programming and want to support our work, please visit our website, eastsidefreedomlibrary.org.